to Utah as assistant professor in 2018. Sarah's expertise and interests are all sorts of aspects of deep magmas, melts, flow, chemistry, rheology, those, both the chemistry and the physical aspects of it. She's also an experimental lepidologist, but I think today you will not tell us anything about experiments, and that's fine. Tomorrow, for those of you who are also interested, tomorrow we have our Lepidology and Geochemistry group seminar at 12:30, so you're more than welcome to join that as well. If you're not on the email list for that, so find me and ask me, I'll add you to that. And with that, Sarah, you go.
Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for the invitation again, and thanks for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk about mantle lithological heterogeneity, but I want to highlight first that this is really a project led by Otto Lang, who is a student in my group. And this is really a COVID project because he's a master student and most of his project has been done during basically lockdown and limited access to the labs. So what I'm going to talk about today is first, I'm going to make sure that we are on the same page by introducing some terminology and basically explain why should we care about the presence of lithological heterogeneity in the mantle. I will briefly present some of the tools that we have been used in the past to trace mantle heterogeneity, and I'm going to explain why the first four transition elements are actually promising. Then I'm going to discuss how we can use both actually experimental samples and natural samples to constrain the partitioning behavior of these elements. And when you use natural samples, what basically good practice you should follow to have a good estimation of the partitioning behavior. And finally, I'm going to show you some result of a very simple modeling that we have done that show basically that we can use FRTs as good tracer for mantle heterogeneity. So before we start, I want to introduce basically the concept of mantle heterogeneity. So there are actually two main schools. The first school is going to consider that the mantle heterogeneity is mostly chemical. So what I mean by that is the mantle is dominated by peridotitic lithologies. So we are on the upper part of this triangle in the Strykeisen classification. And you only have, I would say, limited chemical and mineralogical variations. The second school is going to consider that you can have actually different type of rocks present in the mantle. So we can classify them in two big categories, peridotite and pyroxenite. And for the rest of this talk, I'm going to call basically pyroxenite any mantle lithologies that is not a peridotite. But I want you to keep in mind that this is a very generic term, and that covers actually a very large range of chemical composition, but also mineralogical distribution. Okay, so why should we care about the presence of lithological heterogeneity in the mantle? Well, first, pyroxenites can have various origins. Various geodynamical processes can result into the formation of pyroxenite in the mantle, but one of the most important one is the recycling of the oceanic crust and of the oceanic lithosphere. And so if you are able to discriminate between the presence of only chemical heterogeneity versus the presence of chemical and lithological heterogeneity, that can tell you a lot about the efficiency of convection, mixing, and stirring that is happening in the mantle. The second reason is coming from the melting behavior of pyroxenites. So it is actually well known now that a lot of pyroxenites can present significantly lower solidus temperatures than peridotites. So this is what is illustrated in this figure that shows the alkali content as a function of the Mg number for a compilation of natural pyroxenites. And what those red and green line are separating is two categories of pyroxenites. Pyroxenites that will actually melt before peridotite along an adiabatic decompression path. That's going to be on the left of these lines. and peroxenides that are going to start to melt after the peridotite if you are on the right of this graph. And so the average oceanic the average subducted oceanic crust is going to plot somewhere over there. So it's going to have a significantly lower soil reduced temperature, and so it will potentially start to melt at much higher pressure than peridotite. But more importantly, and often less considered, is also the contrast of melt productivity between peroxenatic lithologies and peridotite lithologies. So this figure presents the degree of melting as a function of the temperature for many different experiments that has been performed on peroxenite in blue and on peridotite in green. Sorry, my mouth is not reacting very well. On peridotite in green. And so what you can see is for the peridotite, you have actually a significant drop of productivity at one point. And this drop of productivity is actually correlated with the disappearance of clinopyroxene in the mineralogical assemblage. On the contrary, pyroxenites tends to keep a very high melt productivity on a much larger melting interval, simply because they have a much larger proportion of pyroxenes in their mineralogical assemblages. And so the result of that is, even if you have a small proportion of pyroxenite in your source, based on the estimation from mantle exposure, we usually consider that it's less than 10% of the mantle. The contribution of the pyroxenite in the magma can be much larger than this. Okay, so how can we trace pyroxenite in basalts? What about isotopes? Isotopes are definitely telling us that the mantle is heterogeneous. There is no question about that. This is a typical plot showing the neodymium isotopic ratio as a function of the strontium isotopic ratio for major oceanic islands. And basically, the good thing with isotopes is they do not fractionate during partial melting and crystallization, which means that the heterogeneity that you see in basalts basically reflect the heterogeneity that is present in the mantle. However, isotopes are not going to tell us anything about the lithological makeup of the source. It's going to tell us something about the geochemical signature of the source, the flavor, something coming from the oceanic crust, something coming from the sediments, but it's not going to tell us anything about the mineralogy of the source. So what about trace elements? So incompatible trace elements in particular, so for instance, the REE are very sensitive to melting conditions and to the bulk composition. So they can tell us a lot about the melting process, but they are not going to be super helpful again to actually trace the mineralogy of the mantle. So this is an example that actually illustrates this problem. So I actually run calculations, 3 different types of calculations for a given bulk composition of the mantle. So the bulk composition of the mantle for these 3 different configurations is the same. What's actually changing is what kind of rocks are present in the mantle. So in the G2 configuration, I have a mix of peridotite and oceanic crust, subducted oceanic crust. In the KG1 and the KG2 configurations, I have a mix of peridotite and a hybrid pyroxenite that is formed by mechanical mixing between the oceanic crust and peridotites. And so these triangles are basically representing the melting areas that will exist beneath mid-ocean ridge for these 3 different configurations. And so you can see that the melting of the mantle is not going to start at all at the same pressure depending on the configuration. And so for the KG2 configuration, you even have the pyroxenatic component, so KG2, that is starting to melt after the peridotite. So based on that, we could expect that we could see some difference in terms of trace element composition of the basalts. So this is what is illustrated on this plot. So this is a multi-element diagrams for incompatible elements. And so the dashed lines are representing the first degree melt produced by each configuration. So the third configuration in blue is showing trace element composition that is very different from the 2 other configurations because remember, in this particular configuration, that's actually the peridotite that start to melt first. However, it's very unlikely that we are going to preserve this, the composition of this first degree melt beneath mid-ocean ridge. Maybe in an inclusion hosted in no-living crystals, but generally what we actually recover at the surface is a result of accumulation of melt on the entire melting area, basically, entire melting column. And that's what is represented by these solid lines. And now when you actually compare the three configurations, because the bulk composition is actually constant, you can see that these three configurations show very similar trace element compositions. Okay, so what about major elements? The problem of major elements is a lot of pyroxenite and peridotite produce melts that have very similar composition. The reason for that is because even if pyroxenite and peridotite do not have at all the same composition and do not actually have at all the same mineralogical assemblages, the main minerals that are actually present stay the same. Basically, it's going to be olivine, pyroxenes, and an aluminous phases. And so the result of that is the melting reaction for a given pressure is going to be relatively similar between pyroxenite and peridotite. So this is what is illustrated on this figure. So what you see is a compilation of experimental melts generated over a large range of pressure and temperature. This compilation is from Yang et al. And it compares actually experimental melts produced by peridotite in green and experimental melt produced by pyroxenite in yellow. So some pyroxenites are going to produce some very distinct composition, but overall you can see that you have a huge overlap between melt produced by peridotite and melts produced by pyroxenites. And I should actually mention that all these parameters, so silica, iron, calcium, aluminium, and titanium, has been proposed at one time or another as actually a good proxy to potentially trace the presence of pyroxenite in the mantle source. Okay, so that being said, Yang et al. Actually recently proposed a new parameter that is described here, and it's basically based on a combination of log ratio. I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but this is a result of their using this parameter basically. And so this is a distribution of this parameter among the same compilation of melts. So green are peridotite melts and yellow are pyroxenite melts. And what you see when you look at this distribution is actually more than 60% of the peridotite melts only overlap with less than 15% of the pyroxenite melt, and more than 55% of the pyroxenite melt only overlap with less than 5% of the peridotite melt. So this is quite promising, but we still have a significant overlap between the pyroxenite and the peridotite melt using this particular parameter. And this is going to be a problem mostly for silica-deficient pyroxenites. So silica-deficient pyroxenites are basically pyroxenites that contain olivine most of the time. And so these silica-deficient pyroxenites are going to plot mostly towards the low value of this parameter. And so they are going to overlap more with lithologies, with the melt produced by peridotitic lithologies. Another issue is in the compilation that exists actually regarding the peridotite melts, there is actually very few data on melting of garnet arsburgite, simply because there is not actually a lot of experimental data on this particular lithology. And garnet arsburgite are actually a lithology that is considered as potentially very important in the subcontinental lithosphere. And there are actually more and more studies that suggest that we have actually the contribution of the melting of the subcontinental lithosphere when we generate intracontinental basalt. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. But the problem with that is if you actually melt garnet arsburgite, you are likely to produce a melt that is relatively rich in silica. And what's going to happen is your melt is actually going to plot toward higher value of this parameter. So this is again going to increase the potential overlap between peridotite melt and pyroxenite melt. Okay, so in summary, isotopes are telling us if the mantle is heterogeneous or not, and it is heterogeneous, but it's not going to give us a lot of info about the mantle lithological makeup, actually, the lithological makeup of the mantle source of basalt. Incompatible trace elements are usually too sensitive to the melting conditions to actually give us some valuable information about the mineralogy of the source. Major elements, in some cases, can actually help to distinguish between the different lithologies present in the mantle source. But if we only rely on major elements, we might actually misinterpret some compositional variation we are seeing because of the big overlap between pyroxenite and peridotite derived melt. So that's where the first row transition elements come in the equation. So those elements can be present as a major element, that's the case for iron, as minor elements, so manganese or nickel, manganese or nickel, or as trace elements in the main phases of the mantle. But what makes them really different in comparison to other trace elements, for instance, that we use in the past, is they have actually contrasted partitioning behavior. So what I mean by that is one particular element can be actually compatible with one particular mantle phase and incompatible with another mantle phase. So I'm going to illustrate that by taking the example of zinc and manganese, so two FRT elements. Manganese tends to prefer to go in garnet, while zinc slightly prefer olivine. So the result of that is the distribution of these two elements is not going to be homogeneous, basically, among these four phases. So why this is important? So imagine that you have a mantle source with a certain concentration, so a certain proportion of manganese and a certain proportion of zinc. If your mantle source is peridotitic, so dominated by olivine and orthopyroxene, what's going to happen is a lot of manganese is going to behave as an incompatible element more than zinc. And so you are going to produce a magma, a basalt, that has a high manganese-zinc ratio. Now, if you take the same bulk composition, but you now have a lithology that is dominated by clinopyroxene and garnet, so something that is closer to a pyroxenite, then manganese is going to behave more, manganese is going to be more compatible with the pyroxenite than zinc, and the magma that you are going to generate is going to have a low manganese-zinc ratio. Okay, so this is a theory, but it's not actually super straightforward to use when you try to model the melting of an heterogeneous mantle. So to illustrate that, I'm showing you this picture, which is a compilation of experimental data performed on different lithologies, and that shows the partitioning coefficient of manganese between the main phases present in the mantle and the liquid. So the different color corresponds to different lithologies, and the different symbols corresponds to different minerals that can be present in the mantle. So circles are for garnet, diamonds are for clinopyroxene, square are for orthopyroxene, and triangle are for olivine. And so what you can see is you have actually a strong correlation or anti-correlation in this case between the partition coefficient and the MgO content of the liquid. So you have a strong compositional dependence of this partitioning coefficient. And because MgO in the liquid is also a proxy for the degree of melting in the mantle, but also, of course, the temperature of the mantle, you also have a strong dependence of these partitioning coefficients with temperature. And when you look at this plot, it's going to actually be quite hard to find a systematic difference between garnet, clinopyroxene, orthopyroxene, and olivine. They all plot, basically, along the same trend. So one way to deal with that is, instead of using partition coefficient, so D. You can use exchange coefficient, so KDs. So exchange coefficient, so this is, for example, the example for exchange coefficients between iron and manganese. And what you can see, so that's the same compilation of data, that's the same color codes, okay? But what you can see is this time, each minerals show a relatively constant, actually, exchange coefficient, okay? So as a function of the composition of the melt. These color bands and the straight lines are actually showing the average calculated value for this exchange coefficients and the one standard deviation for each of these minerals. So, and you can see that they are also quite distinct from each other. Okay, so this is promising because we have now a parameter that is relatively independent of composition and temperature, so it's easier to use in model later on. So what about other FRTs? Well, it's unclear, and it's unclear simply because we have a lack of data. So this is actually data from Véronique Leroux et al. In 2011. And so on this left diagrams, you see the partitioning coefficient for zinc between mineral and melts as a function of the temperature. It doesn't seem to have a big temperature dependence. It doesn't seem to have a big compositional dependence. So you can see, for example, two different compositions for the partition coefficient of olivine here with the red diamond here and the blue diamond here. So they plot about at the same height. There might be some temperature dependence because if you only look at the red dots, it seems to decrease with temperature. Same here with the orthopyroxene. But the error bar are actually quite large, and it's kind of hard to tell directly if we really have such temperature dependence. Same thing with the KDs. Overall, the olivines seems to present slightly higher KDs than clinopyroxene, but orthopyroxene, so the triangles, if you take into account the error bar, are all over the place. Okay, so clearly we need more data to know if we can actually use these FRTs as good proxy for tracing mantle heterogeneity in the mantle lithological heterogeneity. Okay, so this is what we were planning to do, and then COVID happened, so we didn't have access to the lab, so we had to basically change the project. And what we thought is, well, because we don't have access to the lab and we cannot do experiments, let's try to see what we can do with what we have, which are the published value on the natural samples. And so the two questions we really wanted to answer is by using published value on natural samples was, can we actually test the exchange coefficient for other transition elements are also temperature and composition independent? And if yes, can we actually use these FRTs to actually tell us something about the mineralogy of the source? Okay, so very rapidly, what we did is a 3 steps process. I'm not going to go too much into the details, but what we did is actually using the natural compositions that we published in the literature, both on pyroxenite and on peridotite, and we compare that with the experimental data to draw some conclusion. We also wanted to know what is the reliability of using these natural samples. So we did our own analysis on natural pyroxenites. And finally, as a proof of concept, we did some very simple batch melting modeling to see if we can use these FRTs as good proxy for the lithological makeup of the mantle. Okay, so I'm not going to go over the details with the natural data on samples because we did so many tests and we tested so many different parameters that this is going to be extremely boring for you. So instead of that, I'm just going to go over the main point. Okay, so the first point that we actually thought is we also have a temperature dependence of the partition coefficient. So this plot compare with the plot I described before for the partition coefficient of manganese as a function of the MgO concentration of the liquid, which is also a proxy for the temperature, basically. And so this time I'm looking at the partition coefficients between garnet and quinopyroxene for manganese as a function of the temperature. So for the natural samples, we actually calculated the temperature with the Ravna thermometer, and we also plotted the experimental samples, so the red triangle for comparison. So we do have this temperature dependence of the partition coefficient with temperature. So we did the same with the KD, and same thing, we actually got some consistent result using the natural samples. We have actually no systematic variation of the exchange coefficient as a function of the temperature in natural samples. Okay, so now we can actually use the whole set of compilation of data that we have for pyroxenite and peridotite and try to estimate the KD, so the exchange coefficient for each minerals, and basically their uncertainty. So that's what is represented on this plot. You have the manganese-iron ratio for different minerals as a function of the manganese-iron ratio in quinopyroxene. And in this particular plot, the KD is going to be defined by the slope of this linear regression that is forced to pass through the origin of this plot. Okay, and so what you see is when you are doing that, you can actually get a good estimation of the exchange coefficients for each of these minerals with a relatively small uncertainty, despite the large scatters that you observe in natural composition. And the exchange coefficient again show a distinct value between the different minerals. We can also compare what we have on natural pyroxenites with what we have on natural peridotite. And if you actually compare the calculated value on the KD and their uncertainty, you do have a very good overlap between what we obtain on pyroxenite and what we obtain on peridotite. So we already show that we don't have any temperature dependence, but we also do not have any compositional dependence of this exchange coefficient for manganese iron. So I'm showing manganese iron because by far that's the two elements for which we have the most data points in natural data, but we can also look at other FRTs. So I'm going to show you the data for zinc iron this time. So of course we have much less data actually available for zinc iron simply because of the very low concentration of zinc. But we can see that we still have a good constraint on your exchange coefficient. Spinel is a little bit more scattered, but the constraint on garnet and on olivine and orthopyroxene are relatively good. And what you can see also is these exchange coefficients between zinc iron and manganese irons are relatively reverse. Okay, so the garnet, for example, in the zinc iron plot is showing the lowest value for the exchange coefficient, while in the manganese iron plot is going to show the highest value, and same thing the opposite way for spinel here. Because we have so much scatter in those plots, however, as I said, we wanted to see how reliable are those analyses, and to test that, we actually did that by using our own analysis. So we did actually analysis on 10 different pyroxenite samples. You have example of thin section on so on E3 of these samples on the left here. And so in the compilation of samples we had actually samples from ultramafic massif. This is an example of quinopyroxenite from Beni Bussera. We also had mantle xenolites. So you can see a good example of composite xenolites actually from San Carlos here, where you have a nice contact here between websterite on the left and narsburgite on the right. And we also consider some samples that are referred now as arclogite, which are dominated by omphacite and garnet. And those actually xenolites are usually interpreted as mafic cumulates that were formed at the base of the crust in arc settings. And so to actually analyze those samples, we did two types of analysis. We did microprobe analysis on every samples, and we did laser ICP-MS analysis on a selection of these samples. For the microprobe analysis, we actually did that in a two-step process. We first acquired major elements with regular, I would say, condition 15 kilovolts and regular counting time. And as a second step process, we acquired the minor elements using a much higher currents and much longer counting time. And so this is basically a comparison between what we got from the probe and what we got from the laser ICP-MS for minor elements in olivine. So I just plotted olivine here for a series of minor elements, so nickel, manganese, calcium, chrome, and zinc present in olivine. And as you can see, we have actually an excellent correspondence between the analysis that we got at the probe and the analysis that we got at the laser when we use this two-step process for the probe analysis. Okay, so this plot is actually representing the results that we get, again, as an example for manganese iron in our samples. And so each our samples is actually described by one of these boxes, and I'm going to explain that in a second. And we compare our samples to the estimated range of KD that was obtained previously using the whole range of data available in the literature. So our samples show some compositional diversity. I mean, each individual sample, some intra-samples diversity, I would say, some more than others. And what we did is we actually calculated every possible KD estimated by every possible pair of minerals for each of these samples. And that's what represents this big box, okay? So, as you can see, the intra-sample of the intravariability of the samples is quite big, and if we actually take some of the samples that show the largest variability, this can be a serious problem, because if we take this purple box here, so that corresponds to every possible pair of garnet clinopyroxene in one particular sample, and we try to calculate the KD, let's say, by estimating one pair randomly of clinopyroxene and garnet, you can have anything that is between these two dashed lines. So what this is showing you is clearly you cannot trust individual pair of minerals acquired on one particular samples. It doesn't actually matter how good your analysis is. You cannot actually trust natural samples and just a few natural samples and a few analyses to give you a good constraint on the partitioning behavior of FRTs in samples. And I just want to insist on that, because for those particular samples, we actually had relatively fresh samples. We use high precision analytical techniques, and we really made sure that we were analyzing parts that were completely fracture-free and inclusion-free. So we were super careful in the analysis, and we still got basically this large compositional variability. Okay, so what if instead of just, you know, randomly selecting two analyses in a sample, so I'm actually looking at the average of my samples. So that's what is represented by these circles actually on this diagram. So each of these circles corresponds to the average KD calculated for these samples. Purple are for garnet clinopyroxene, greens are for olivine clinopyroxene, and black are for orthopyroxene clinopyroxene. And so let's look at what we got if we actually use the garnet clinopyroxene pair, and if we try from these two particular samples to have a good estimation of the exchange coefficient for manganese iron. So we do the linear regression, and we got this red line. So qualitatively speaking, we are still, you know, modeling the correct partitioning behavior. The exchange coefficient is still higher than 1. It's not actually that far from the experimental, not the experimental, it's not actually that far from the range that were obtained using the whole compilation of data. but it's not in that. So how do we actually fall in this range? So another way to ask this question is basically, how many samples do I need to be confident in my estimation of my exchange coefficient? So to answer this question, we did a very simple exercise. So this is a plot I showed before that shows a whole compilation of data for pyroxenites to actually estimate the exchange coefficients for manganese iron. The only difference is this time I'm actually only plotting data for garnet cryopyroxene. Okay. And so what we did is we randomly selected small group of samples and tried to calculate the KD for each of these groups. So for comparison, this is the KD that we obtain from the whole compilation of data, but for orthopyroxene. So this is the first example where we actually use group of samples that only contain 10 samples. So each group contains 10 samples, and each of these green line correspond to the KD calculated using the linear regression among these 10 randomly selected samples. And this is not a true statistical analysis it's not a true statistical analysis, but clearly it's actually showing that 10 samples is not big enough as a number of samples to actually be constrained in this range of KD that is determined by the whole compilation of data. So you can increase the size of your group like that, and eventually if you do that, you will see that you actually need probably around 40 samples to be confident with the estimation of your exchange coefficient. Okay, so this was a side note, I would say. Now I'm going to go back to what I wanted to try at the beginning, which is a test of FRTs as a good tracer, as a good tracer for lithological heterogeneity in the mantle. So we can do that because we have good estimation of our partitioning, of our exchange coefficient using the whole compilation of data. And we also demonstrated that these exchange coefficients are independent of temperature variation and independent of composition. So to test that, what we did is we actually selected on purpose two very contrasted series of basalt, one coming from Iceland and one coming from Samoa. Iceland showing a high manganese iron ratio and a low zinc iron ratio, and Samoa showing a low manganese iron ratio and a high zinc iron ratio. So based on our observation and the previous theory, what we could expect is Iceland, the mineralogy of the source of basalt in Iceland is going to tend toward something more peridotitic, while the mineralogy of the source of Samoa is going to tend towards something that is more pyroxenitic. The classical approach to look at this problem is usually to consider that your mantle is composed of two lithologies, peridotite and pyroxenites, and to solve for the proportion of pyroxenite to explain this manganese iron ratio and zinc iron ratio. But to do that, you actually need several input parameters. You first need to know what is the composition, so the manganese iron ratio and the zinc iron ratio for each lithologies. And more importantly, you also need to assume some predefined mineralogy for each of these lithologies. And doing that, you will be able to actually estimate what is the proportion of pyroxenite-derived melt in the mantle. After that, you still need to use tools such as MELT-PX, for example, to get back to the proportion of pyroxenite in the source, because those tools are going to help you to take into account the difference of melting behavior between each lithologies that I introduced earlier in this presentation. So instead of actually using this approach, we use a fundamentally different approach. What we did is we actually solve for the average mineralogical assemblage present in the source. And the advantage of doing that is we do not have to actually assume any mineralogy. We are going to let the model find out what is the mineralogy that best fit and best reproduce the manganese iron ratio and the zinc iron ratio. And we also need only one particular composition, which is the bulk composition of the mantle source. Okay, so here are the results using the iron manganese ratio. In blue, I have Iceland. In yellow, I have the Samoa data. And what this is showing is the mineralogy of the source that can explain the average manganese iron ratio for Iceland and the average manganese iron ratio for Samoa. So each of these bubbles correspond to a different solution that can exist and that can actually reproduce those ratios. And the size of this bubble is actually correlated to the Garnett-CPX ratio in the mantle source. And so on a first order, what you can see is the result that we got from this one ratio is actually consistent with our expectation. We have a source for Iceland that is more rich in olivine and orthopyroxene than the source for Samoa. But more importantly, the range of mineralogy that can actually explain this ratio is huge. Basically, you don't only have one mineralogy that can explain a given manganese iron ratio, you have a full range of mineralogy that can explain a given manganese iron ratio. You can do the same exercise using the zinc iron ratio, and you will get the same conclusion, basically. A huge range of mineralogy can actually explain a given zinc manganese ratio. But it's actually becoming interesting when you combine this ratio. So this is what is represented here. So I have the manganese iron ratio result for Iceland. So we are going to focus on Iceland for a second. So I have the manganese iron result for Iceland here, and I have the zinc iron result for Iceland here. And you can see that you have some overlap. This is actually quite messy because we are looking at a 2D projection for 4 different minerals. So for a second, we are going to look at the same thing, but in 3D. So you can see that this is actually the same view, okay, except that it's rotated counterclockwise by 60 degrees. And so I'm going to get rid of the pointer so I can actually start the video. So that's basically the manganese iron ratio that you can see here. You can also show the zinc iron ratio results that are shown here, okay? And if you only focus on the first set of data and you manipulate this tetrahedron, you realize that all the data fits on one plane. It's actually normal. We are actually looking at an equation for 4 different parameters in 3D. So it's totally normal that the data fit on one particular plane. What's interesting, if you plot the data of the second set of results, so using the zinc iron ratio, they are obviously also going to fall on a plane, but not the same plane. And so you will have an intersection of this plane. So if you actually look at that in 3D, the overlap between the 2 sets of results is actually very limited. It's just going to be the intersection between these 2 planes. Again, I repeat, the only reason I have a plan is because I have 4 minerals and 1 equation. If you introduce an additional phase in your mantle, then you will have a volume potentially. Okay. But in our potential, in our first case, in our proof of concept here, using a relatively simple modeling, we only have an intersection between these 2 planes. And so now if we look actually at this particular intersection, what you can see is the olivine mode is actually relatively constant. The orthopyroxene mode varies a little, but the main parameter is actually the proportion of clinopyroxene in this source. So we can use, so I'm going to get back my pointer. We can use the same representation we used before. So this projection here to actually project this intersection of 2 planes on this projection. And you can see that now if you actually only consider the overlap, the range of mineralogy that can explain both ratio for Iceland is very limited. You can do the exact same exercise with the Samoa basalt. And if you plot that on this projection, again, you can see that now we don't have at all any overlap between the data for Samoa and the data for Iceland. And if I compare that with what we got when we were using only one FRT ratio, you can see that the difference is striking. So in summary, are FRTs good lithological tracer? Well, if you use them individually, not really, but they become potentially a very powerful tool to get information about the mineralogical distribution of the source if you combine them. Okay, so one downside of our approach is we actually don't get any information about the potential presence of several lithologies in the mantle source. Okay, remember in the classical approach, you actually assume that you have several lithologies in the mantle source. In our approach, you actually calculate the average mineralogical assemblage of the source. But I actually think that this could be extremely useful for later on modeling the melting of an heterogeneous mantle. Because if you look actually at the source, the average mineralogy source that we model for these two series of basalt, it's clear that you cannot use in your input parameter for modeling the melting of an heterogeneous mantle the same two lithologies for the two suite of basalt. The basalt from Iceland seems to have an average mineralogy that is basically consistent with something between an enriched peridotite and an olivine-rich websterite. This is actually consistent with what has been suggested before, saying that the average of the source of Iceland is probably a combination of peridotite and hybrid lithologies such as KG1 and KG2. The average lithology for Samoa is actually much more refractory, but contain a much larger mode of garnet. And so this is also consistent with the very thick lithosphere that is present beneath Samoa Island. So I think actually what we can do with our approach is actually using that as a first step into the modeling of an heterogeneous mantle that will give us very precious information about the average mineralogical assemblage of the source, and so will guide us to do a better choice in terms of the mineralogy for each lithologies that we can use for the melting of an heterogeneous mantle. And so that's what we plan to do next. So as a take-home message, I just wanted to highlight that, yes, FRTs are actually powerful tracer of the mantle heterogeneity if they are used combined, but for that we need more data. So we need more experimental data, of course. For now, basically, those data, I think there are actually 2 or 3 experimental data actually focus on the partitioning behavior of FRTs. But I also would like to encourage the scientific community to analyze actually FRTs more routinely during the probe and laser sessions, because natural samples can be very useful, as we just seen, to actually characterize the partition coefficients of this, the partitioning behavior of these elements. But for that, we need diverse samples. But natural samples can also be very useful for some of the elements that can be more challenging to actually study experimentally. I didn't talk about nickel today, but everybody knows that there are some very big challenges in using nickel in high pressure experiments. So if we can actually use natural data instead of high pressure experiments on nickel to actually constrain the partition behavior of this particular element, that will be very nice. So we have a lot of data on natural olivine, of course, but we don't have that much data on the other phases. To conclude, I just want to briefly introduce what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. So I initially thought I would talk about samples that we collected a friend collected actually in Cape Verde. And so I'm not going to do that because the project is actually not as advanced as I thought, but I still wanted to share this nice scene section because first it's a beautiful scene section and why not share it? And the second reason is because the samples from Cape Verde are actually known to be relatively rich in iron. So this is actually these blue minerals that you see there. But personally, I never seen such level of enrichment in iron. So I'm quite excited to start working on the data we actually acquired on these samples. But what I'm going to do tomorrow is actually tell you a short story about a short story about a study on which I actually collaborated recently. So this is a study led by Hong Xu, who looked at the chemical evolution with time and space of the continental alkali basalt. And I'm going to keep it short simply because I also want to say a few words about two other projects that I'm particularly excited about. A new experimental project that we are going to look actually at the effect of magma migration, but using open system experiments. And I also been invited to actually sail as a petrologist for the next IODP mission on the continental margin of Norway. We don't know yet if the full science party is going to go because of COVID restriction, but I'm very excited about that because this will be my first cruise actually. And that's it for today. Thank you for listening.
You know the clapping because I forgot I couldn't unmute in time.
Okay,
so again. Thank you.
Any questions?
I have one. Yeah, I'm going to turn the video on.
Oh, we. Yeah.
That's all right. Could be heard.
So
Let me see. Go.
So thanks, Sarah. Really good talk, and kind of nice to see people taking interest in the transition elements and all our beloved parasitic minerals. Just wanted to know, you mentioned zinc very briefly, but then when you actually came to do your modeling, you didn't include any of the zinc results, but obviously that has such a strong result. Sorry, Spinel data. Spinel has such a strong effect on zinc, having the highest partition coefficient.
Yep, that's an excellent question actually. So I just want to make sure we are on the same page. So I did actually I actually show the result using both zinc and iron manganese ratio, zinc iron ratio and manganese iron ratio using.
Sorry, I said the question the wrong way around. I meant you mentioned Spinel and its effect on zinc early, but you then didn't include Spinel in the modeling, right?
Yeah, and so that's that's still an excellent question, and I'm going to show what why this is important actually. That's it. Which one is it? Yes. Is it working? I guess so. Yeah. Okay. So let me go back to what you are referring to, which is going to be this particular figure that actually show what you are saying. So zinc actually is very much incorporated into Spinel, and Spinel in general, when you look at these FRTs, is always behaving some kind of an N member. You can see that he has a very high exchange coefficient for zinc iron and a very low exchange coefficients for manganese iron. So it's totally reasonable to think that this is going to have a huge effect on the modeling. And so to test that, what we did is we actually did some modeling by adding 5% of Spinel into the mantle. Why 5%? Because except if you are dealing with such, you know, atypical lithologies such as chromites, yeah, I think, and stuff like that, the proportion of Spinel, both in peridotite and in pyroxenite, is relatively small. And if you actually do a modeling by changing from 0 to 5% the proportion of Spinel in this particular model, it's not actually changing the position of this result by much. Is that answering your question?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, Sarah. It's Rodri Davis. I'm technically in the room in another.
Yeah, I see you.
First of all, thanks for sticking up for me at Goldschmidt 3 years ago. I really appreciate that. My question, it's probably a dumb question. So you've kind of found that in Iceland and Samoa you get potentially different proportions of pyroxenite in the source, but does that allow you to say that the plumes have different proportions of pyroxenite, or just what's melted? I'm thinking about the pressure effect, right? Because in Iceland you're melting very shallow,
yeah.
In Samoa it's deeper.
Yeah, and I think that's come back to what I was saying at the end. So for Samoa, basically what we are saying is a very high proportion of garnet, but not so much in terms of pyroxene, neither orthopyroxene or clinopyroxene. So we are actually dealing with something that is quite refractory, but with a high proportion of garnet. So the high proportion of garnet is definitely an indication of very deep melting, which could be explained by high temperature potentially, but it's also easily explained simply because you have a thick lithosphere, so you actually stop melting probably at very high pressure. It's actually a relatively unusual lithology that I was not I was actually quite surprised to get for the Samoa basalt. So if I understood your question was, yeah, so yes, the data are indicating much higher pressure than for Samoa than for Iceland, but this could be explained by a difference of thickness of the lithosphere without necessarily changing the lithologies or the temperature that is actually present in the mantle. The lithologies, however, are still going to be very different because for Samoa, we got actually relatively refractory lithologies in comparison to Iceland.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I can ask that one of the ones that he's had to go.
Oh, so
Yeah, so we have one question from Mark Norman. I think he had to leave, but he left behind a question, which was, how would you begin to incorporate polybaric melting into the model?
So that's a good question. So we can actually, for this one, we really want to do a proof of concept. As I said, this was actually a project conducted by my student, by a student in my group, Otto Leng, and he did this part of modeling actually at the end of his master. So he really didn't have time to really dig into the thermodynamics of polybaric melting. But that's definitely something that we can do, and we did that before for modeling heterogeneous mantle heterogeneous for modeling the adiabatic decompression of an heterogeneous mantle. The thing we will need to figure out is basically, so I'm trying to think how I'm going to incorporate that in my model. So what I will need to test for that is, for now, what I tested is, do we have actually a big variation of the iron manganese ratio with the degree of melting when we use a simple modal melting batch melting equation, basically? And the answer is no. And so that's why we were able to use this average manganese iron ratio and zinc iron ratio. What I will need to do to incorporate polybaric melting is trying to see if that is still true when you actually incorporate a change of pressure into the calculation of the average manganese iron ratio. And that's definitely something we need to think about.
Thank you very much. Mark is still online, so you can chat afterwards, but I think it's a good time probably now to bring the formal part of the proceedings to an end, and we'll leave the Zoom running for a few minutes if anybody wants to chat and talk informally. But one more time, if you'd join me in saying thank you to Sarah for a very interesting seminar. Thank you.
And I just wanted to say that I really appreciate your acknowledgement of the land at the beginning of your presentations, of the introduction. So thank you for that.
there was someone in the chat asking what's the link for tomorrow's talk. So